My name is Daniel and I'm 34 years old. When I was 9 years old, I watched my father leave our house with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag full of shoes, and he didn't say goodbye. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and the porch light was flickering the way it always did before it finally burned out. He just looked at me standing in the hallway in my socks, and he said, "Take care of your mother," like I was 30 instead of 9. That was the last full sentence my father ever said to me in our house. I stood there for 11 minutes, I counted the second hand on the kitchen clock, before my mother came out of the bedroom and found me still standing in the same spot, my toes cold against the hardwood. For 22 years after that night, I promised myself I would never be the reason a child stood alone in a hallway. I built my whole life around being the man who stays. I stayed late at work, sometimes until 9 or 10 p.m., just to make sure the bills were never late. I stayed calm during arguments, biting down my own anger, so nothing ever escalated the way it did in my parents' house. I stayed loyal, even when loyalty was inconvenient, even when it cost me friendships, promotions, comfort. Staying was the only thing I knew how to be good at, because it was the one thing nobody had ever given me. Then I met Rachel. Rachel was 31, a pediatric nurse, and the first person who ever made staying feel easy instead of like work. I remember our third date, sitting in her car outside a small diner at 11:40 at night, the engine ticking as it cooled, a paper coffee cup sweating in the console between us. She reached over and fixed the collar of my jacket before I got out, just a small, quiet thing, and said, "You look tired, Daniel. Are you sleeping okay?" Nobody had asked me that in years. 3 years later I married her in a backyard ceremony. With 40 folding chairs and strings of warm yellow lights hung between 2 oak trees, and I remember thinking, standing there in a rented gray suit, this is what staying is supposed to feel like. For the last 6 years, I told myself we were fine. Then, 18 days ago, everything started to change. Rachel began conference trips. 3 of them in 6 weeks, always to the same city 2 hours south, always 2 nights, always booked less than 48 hours in advance. I didn't say anything at first. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was the same old fear my father planted in me at age 9, following me into a marriage that didn't deserve it. I even helped her pack once, folding her blazers the way she liked, telling myself I was being a good husband. Then, 6 days before what would have been our anniversary, I was looking for my passport in the hallway closet, the same kind of closet my father had packed his suitcases from, all those years ago, and I found a manila folder tucked behind a stack of old tax documents. My hands were shaking a little before I even opened it, like some part of me already knew. Divorce papers. Already drafted. Already signed on her line, in her small, looping handwriting. Dated 11 days earlier. She hadn't said a single word to me. That night, at 9:15 p.m., I heard the wheels of her suitcase rolling down the hallway, that same small squeak the front left wheel always made. She said, casually, without looking at me, "Early flight tomorrow, another conference." I asked her what conference. She hesitated, just half a second too long, long enough that I noticed, and said, "The usual one." "You know how it is." I did know how it is. I just didn't know that she knew that I knew. I didn't confront her that night. I lay awake instead, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, and I told myself I needed to understand why before I said anything at all. The next afternoon, I called her sister, Meg, under the excuse of asking about a birthday gift. Somewhere in the conversation, she let it slip, almost apologetically, her voice dropping low. "Rachel said she's been feeling trapped for a while, Daniel. Like she can't breathe in this marriage." Meg's motivation wasn't cruelty, it was guilt. She'd known for weeks and hadn't told me, because she was scared of losing her sister's trust if she did. That's the human thing about betrayal, it spreads quietly through people who don't even want to be part of it, until everyone is holding a piece of the same secret. What Rachel didn't know was that 4 months earlier, our financial advisor had flagged something strange in a routine review. Rachel had quietly opened a separate account and had been moving money out of our joint savings, a little at a time, small enough not to trigger any alarms. $400 here, $600 there, always on Thursdays. I hadn't said anything to her about it. Instead, I did something my father never did for my mother. I protected myself quietly, and I protected the truth, gathering it the way you gather kindling before a fire you hope you'll never need to light. I hired a lawyer. Not for revenge. For clarity. What Rachel also didn't know was that the house, the one she assumed was ours and the way people assume things are ours when they've never bothered to check the paperwork, was still legally in my name only, purchased 2 years before we ever married, with the mortgage solely under me. She had lived there for 6 years believing shared history meant shared ownership. It didn't. I found the papers on a Tuesday. I didn't confront her until the following Sunday, at her sister's house, during a small family dinner, the kind of dinner where 12 people sit around a long table, passing bowls of green beans and mashed potatoes, pretending everything is normal, the smell of roast chicken still hanging in the air. Meg's husband asked, innocently, reaching for the bread basket, "So when's the next work trip, Rachel?" Rachel smiled, twirling her fork. "Actually, next month, I think." I set my fork down slowly, the metal clinking softly against the ceramic plate. The room got quiet the way rooms do right before something breaks. "There's no conference," I said. My voice didn't shake. "There hasn't been one in 6 weeks. Rachel's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks. "Daniel, not here." "You signed the papers 11 days ago," I said. "You didn't tell me. You were going to let me find out from an envelope in the mail." Silence. Real silence, the kind where you can hear a fork touch a plate 3 feet away, where the ceiling fan overhead suddenly sounds too loud. Her mother looked at Rachel, her lips pressed into a thin line. Meg looked down at her napkin, twisting it in her hands, ashamed. Rachel's father cleared his throat but said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would fix what was already sitting on the table between us. "This is not a mistake," I said, calm, steady, the way I'd rehearsed it quietly in my head for 6 days straight. "It has been happening for weeks. And it has been mine to prepare for, quietly, for months." Rachel's voice cracked. "You went through my things." "No," I said. "I went through our life. And I found out I was the only one still living in it." She didn't have a comeback. She looked around the table for someone, anyone, to defend her, and no one did, not even her own sister, who finally looked up, her eyes red, and said quietly, "Rach, I told you this would come out eventually." I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't need to. The truth had already done the work my anger never could have done. I stood up, thanked her parents for dinner, and left, the cool night air hitting my face like something clearing. 2 weeks later, the divorce was finalized faster than either of us expected, mostly because there was nothing left to fight over that wasn't already settled on paper. The house stayed mine, not out of spite, but because it always had been. I offered Rachel 6 months of the health insurance we'd shared, even though I didn't have to, because petty was never who I wanted to become. My father taught me what abandonment looked like. I didn't need to teach myself what cruelty looked like too. Rachel moved 2 hours away, closer to Meg, into a small apartment above a laundromat. We don't speak often. When we do, it's short and polite, the way conversations are between 2 people who used to build a life together and now just close out the paperwork of it, 1 email at a time. 3 months later, I sat in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, the same kitchen Rachel used to fill with the smell of coffee before her trips. Sunlight came in slanted through the blinds, catching dust in the air. The house was quiet, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't the quiet of waiting for someone to come home. It was the quiet of finally being able to breathe in my own space. I made 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. I sat by the window, watching a neighbor walk their dog down the street. And for the first time since I was 9 years old standing in that hallway, I didn't feel like the boy waiting to be left behind. I felt like a man who chose, calmly, to stop waiting. If you've ever sat at a table full of people who loved someone more than they loved the truth, you know what that silence feels like. If you've ever found out you were the last one to know something everyone else had already guessed, you know how heavy that quiet car ride home can be. Here's what I've learned: staying loyal to someone should never cost you your own peace. Boundaries aren't punishment, they're just the truth, spoken calmly, at the right time. You don't have to yell to be heard. Sometimes the strongest thing you can say is simply, "I already know." If this story reminded you of your own hallway, your own suitcase, your own quiet moment of finally seeing clearly, you're not alone in it. Every story on this channel is for someone who needed to hear exactly this, at exactly this moment. If that's you tonight, consider subscribing, because there's another story waiting for you, and it might be the one that finally makes sense of yours.